Good evening and welcome to Town Meeting Television's continuing coverage of election 2020. We're so glad to be here this evening with four candidates who are running for the House of Representatives in Vermont, but who are uncontested, and we're glad to welcome you here. Robert Hooper, District 6-1, the New North End, and Carol Odie, also in District 6-1, the New North End, welcome. And Jill Krowinski, who is in the Old North End, District 6-3 with Curt McCormack, who is not with us tonight. So we have 6-1 in the New North End and 6-3 in the Old North End. Thank you all for joining us. We have a series of questions that we're going to ask you, and hopefully we'll have a little conversation on them. But Jill, why don't we start with you? Why are you running, and what qualifies you to be a legislator again?
Oh, well, first off, Lauren, Glenn, thank you for creating this space for candidates and for voters. I really appreciate all that CCTV does for our community. So thank you for creating this space for us tonight. So my name is Jill Krowinski, and Representative Curt McCormack and I represent the Old North End in downtown Burlington in the House. I'm running for re-election because I believe we need to create a Vermont that works for everyone, not just the wealthy few. I believe that my experience from serving as a library commissioner to my work at Planned Parenthood for years, my work serving as your state rep, serving this community for 9 years, my experience as House Majority Leader gives me the tools to continue my service to our community in Montpelier. Right. I hope I can count on your support.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Bob Hooper, why don't we go next to you? Tell us why you're running for re-election. This would be your second term, am I right?
It is indeed. I'm coming off the back bench. Why am I running? I'm running because it was so enjoyable the first time to sit in this room for half a year and look at everybody on these 2x2 screens. No, I think I'm running because never having been exposed to actually working in the legislature other than as a lobbyist, it's a completely new facet of how Vermont works. After having spent 30 years working in state government, I just developed that sort of interest in trying to make it better from the experience of somebody that actually has been there, putting the nuts and bolts together and moving things forward. I spent a lot of time in human services. I worked for Social Security Disability and in DCF as a probation officer. And then I stepped out of that role and started to be the union president. So I got a broad exposure to all of state government, from the vets home to the air base to people that are plowing the roads in the winter or plugging the holes in the summer. So I sort of thought I would bring that forward and try to integrate that into pieces of legislation that could be better because you have a voice of somebody that has tried to implement the laws. I say to my fellow employees, we don't work for the governor. And quite frankly, we don't work for our employer in terms of the people that sit there and supervise us. State employees work for the legislature because they're the people that put the government together and establish the framework, create the bills that give us our jobs to do. So that's why I wanted to be involved.
Thank you so much, Bob. Carol Odie, you're running for re-election. What term would this be for you?
Well, if re-elected, this will be my third term. And thank you, Lauren, Glenn, and Channel 17 for having us. I'm running because I want to continue to serve my district and Vermont. My husband, Paul, and I brought our 4 children up in the New North End, and they went to school at Flynn, Hunt, and BHS. I work hard and I listen, most importantly, and I bring the priorities of my district to the State House. I've been a public servant for many years, whether on the Vermont State Board of Education or the Burlington School Board. And I'm committed to the goals that you, my constituents, have told me are your high priorities: an economy that works for all Vermonters, with environmental protection and with equity, racial, social, and environmental justice. I've completed 4 years, as I said, in the legislature. I've been on the House Natural Resources, Fish and Wildlife Committee, and I've also been appointed to the Lake Champlain Citizens Advisory Committee. My work over the years has gained me recognition by the National Conference of State Legislators. I'm a Henry Toll Fellow, and by the YMCA for Leadership in Public Service, and by the Burlington School Board, where I spent the decade of the 1990s and received their Golden Apple Award for service. I'm grateful very much for past your past support, and I ask you for your continued support so I can continue to do the work I love for my district and for all Vermont.
Thank you so much, Lodi. So Bob, I'm going to start with you on the next question, which is, what are your priorities? And I'd like you to kind of talk about what's important to you and what you've worked on in the legislature. And, perhaps that topic is one of the ones on our list, so we could maybe talk about it together. So why don't you start with the priority you've been working on and think needs to be accomplished in the next session?
Well, when I came in, thanks. Actually, let me say thanks to everybody, and particularly to those that might be watching. I have a tendency, although my first answer disproved it, to listen more and talk less. But it would be great if we could get a lot of questions in from the people who we actually serve. When I came in, I asked to be on government operations, and I was fortunate enough to be put there. Follows back to I worked in government. I think I know how it works. We did a lot of work with S54, the marijuana bill. We did cannabis bill. We did a lot of work with fair and equitable policing, training at the academy, a lot of the nuts and bolts of how government actually responds to citizens. That was great stuff, and I felt very fulfilled getting stuff across the finish line in that regard. During this time of break that we've had here, I've been spending a lot of time looking at environmental stuff, and it's frankly scaring me a lot. I think that we need to do much more. One of my priorities will be trying to get more non-fuel consuming cars on the road. And the other might be looking at trying desperately to get broadband to the last mile and into towns as opposed to from the core out. I think if one thing that this plague has identified for us, it's that the wire that comes into your home is not anything like a luxury. It is now a necessity. So high-speed broadband, reliable. It's amazing how many legislators can't speak and be viewed at the same time on these Zoom calls because of inadequate broadband. That should be a big priority for us, but money is going to be scarce.
Are there any priorities, Carol, that you heard Bob talk about that you share?
Yes, broadband, especially for all Vermonters. We've got to be able to help our children who are often accessing education from home. And we have passed some legislation in healthcare regarding a way to be seen by healthcare providers over the internet rather than having to go in person to have an appointment. And that's very helpful today. And this telemedicine will help as we go through the future moving forward for all Vermonters. I want
you to talk more about your priorities in 1 second, but let me just ask Jill, the broadband issue, I think is important beyond Burlington. Burlington seems to be pretty well served, but when people talk about the broadband issue, that we don't have broadband, it's actually not true. We do have broadband, but there is a problem, an access problem. Can you say more about this, Jill?
Yes, absolutely. So there's an access issue, and there are some corners of our state where the broadband lines don't make it all the way down the road, or they're not up to the level to deal with our current predicament when you have parents on their computers trying to do work, and then the kids also on the Wi-Fi trying to do the work. And so the capacity for broadband isn't being met by the needs that our families have across the state as we deal with this pandemic. And I think that you could say that along so many other things that we've learned during this time, when we've seen the issues with access to childcare, access to paid family leave. I just think that COVID has really shown us all the inequities and challenges that we already knew about, but just have made them so much more clear and brought more attention to saying these are priorities we need to solve.
Thank you. Carol, say more about your priorities that are important to you work on next session.
Well, bills that I really think will help us most right here in Burlington and in our neighborhoods are paid family and medical leave. We were one vote away from a veto override to have that for Vermonters. It's a really important social safety net, which has become more clear as we've been through this COVID-19 pandemic. And it will help working Vermonters care for their aging parents who are sick, for their children who are sick, and when they have babies and they need some time to care for those babies, newborns, and childcare. That's one. Another is clean water funding, and to continue pushing forward with that, make sure we're doing it in the most cost-effective way. And there is something coming up called a 3-acre stormwater permit, and I will be working to be sure we have engineering expertise and help with funding for those of us who are living in places in cities where there's impervious surface, which is hard surface, and where there's 3 acres or more of development, because it is from those areas that runoff is going into the lake and polluting the lake, as well as from other things like agriculture and other things. And Act 250, protecting our, Act 250, protecting our forests and forest habitat, and an exemption for Burlington's downtown. And then finally, changing the education formula weighting. That's so that we'll have equity for Vermont property taxpayers and equity for Vermont school children. And these 4 items will truly benefit Burlingtonians.
Thank you. I feel like the education equity question, as long as I've been doing this since 1990, has been on the table, and we haven't quite nailed it. Jill, I'm going to give you a chance to talk about your priorities now, and I imagine paid family leave is one of them.
Yes, absolutely. I've been working my entire legislative career has been working up to getting us to this point where we can find a universal paid family leave program in our state. And we came so close, and I'm going to continue to work for that. We've mentioned a lot of the issues around supporting families and making sure we're really creating a level playing field for them when it comes to childcare, broadband, and our environment, and making sure that we are leaving a better, cleaner environment for the next generation. We can't let what's happening around our country happen here when it comes to I just feel like every day there's something that happens someplace where we lose another Black or brown life. We did some really good work, some first steps regarding racial justice and criminal justice reform, but we need to do more. And our work is far from over. And the Social Equity Caucus has been working to come up with some ideas, and there are coalitions across the state saying, what can we do next to make sure that we have equity and justice in our state? I remember when the speaker gave her opening remarks 2 years ago to the session, talking about an approach to climate change and saying, what if every committee that we have in this building talks about how climate change impacts the issues of that committee, from education to government operations to healthcare. And I was thinking the other day, what if we did the same thing with equity and justice? What if we had every committee folding that in and talking about, okay, we're talking about education funding. What does equity and justice mean when we look at the weighting study, for example, that Carol mentioned? I think we have a lot of opportunity to come together, and this is something that's a major top priority for me.
We actually,
Go ahead, Carol. Yeah.
We've actually come many steps closer to improving this. With the weighting study, we can, by adding one category of weight, which would be rural education, and then by increasing the weighting for children who are English language learners and for children in poverty throughout the state, that will help all children everywhere. And we have the study in front of us, and we were very close to moving forward on that with a plan for implementation of it from the Agency of Education, and then COVID hit. So I still believe that we will be able to move forward, and it will be a high priority.
And can you just say a little bit more about the weighting study? So what's it meant to do, and what makes you think that that approach will work?
Well, when Act 60 started, I was on the Burlington School Board. And before Act 60, we had other proposals to change education funding. And when Act 60 was in front of us, it started out with a block grant of $5,000 per child. And then if you were that a district would receive. And if it was a child in poverty, they got $5,000 plus 25% more, because there was an acknowledgement that it was more costly to serve the needs of those who are poor. And then if you were an ELL student, you had a 0.1 extra weighting added to that $5,000, because for the same reason. And high school students had a 0.25 increase in what they received per student from that formula. But we were making our best guesses back then. I shouldn't say we, but as a school board member, I was advocating just for the best guesses that we had, and the legislature did, to figure out how much money to give per student. And now we have had this study, and we know it wasn't enough. So this study will help us with the recommendation about how to change and fix it,
Got it.
update it.
Yeah. Well, let me ask each of you about the budget. I mean, all of these things that we're talking about cost money. How are we going to manage what potentially will be a fairly significant income revenue loss across the state? Or maybe I should ask you, how do you see next year's budget, and how do you see the redistribution of resources to cover these things that are important as you've described them? And Bob, let me start with you, since we haven't heard from you in a little bit on this question.
Well, I'll pull a Mike Pence and say something about the last question. When I first started in state government, I worked for refugee resettlement. That was 30 years ago. I think that it's an education issue, because we need to educate the rest of the state about the diversity and demands that schools have these days as a result of so much great diversity coming in, and the expense that school districts bear. I think next budget it's an unknown at this point, because one day we're not doing anything to help states and local governments, and the next day we might do everything in terms of the rainfall that might come down from the feds. I really stick my head in the news and say I have no qualms in going along with what Governor Snelling did decades ago and saying those that have the ability to pay more should, and trying to get a little bit more into the budget that way. We did S54, the pot bill. It's not going to do anything for us for a good bit of time. There are other revenue streams we could identify, but they're going to be drops in the bucket. It's going to be a tough budget year. I would start to look for people that the feds have given a bounty to, and maybe ask for a little back from them. That's my first step.
You mean it asked from something back in their state budget?
It was called the Snelling surcharge at that point, and it added to the basic income tax computation of people that made over.
Oh, I see.
Amount.
Public. Yeah, I understand. Okay, great. Thank you for that. Carol, actually, let me ask Jill, tell us your approach to what's your analysis of the budget coming up for next year, and how do you want to approach it? And, you're working in an environment with a governor who doesn't want to spend assess any more taxes or fees. So how do you accomplish that?
Yeah, no, Lauren Glenn, that's a great question. And I'm going to be honest with you, it's almost impossible to answer this question without knowing what's going to be happening in Washington, D.C. in January. Thanks to Senator Leahy, our state received $1.25 million in COVID relief funding. And just to put that into context, Vermont is second only to Wyoming in the size of its per capita payout. It's unheard of what we've gotten compared to other states. And it's the reason why we were able to balance a budget this year without impacting critical programs that Vermonters rely on. I'm really proud of the work that we've done over the past years to invest in our rainy day funds and our unemployment funds, and that will help us with the budget next year. But I think my strategy on the budget will be to hear from Vermonters about what's working and not working, where we can make investments or changes and make decisions based on up-to-date fiscal information. If Governor Scott's reelected, like you said, he's going to come back to us with a budget proposed cuts and cuts and cuts and no vision and no strategy. And at the end of the day, I think it's not whether government is too big or small, it's about who government is serving. So in Vermont, we want a government that works for our working families. So that's the strategy I'll take.
Thank you. Carol Odie, your thoughts about the budget challenges and ways to fund the things that are priorities for you?
Well, we so far have not been able to use federal corona relief funds to backstop local and state revenue shortfalls. So something that we should definitely be doing, and we are, is to work with our congressional delegation, who's been responsible for bringing us so much help so far, so that they will help us in those two areas. We've had a balanced budget for years, and I think it's a great idea to see as much as possible that we can continue with that. And as Jill said, we have reserves in our rainy day fund. We've been continuing to pay down our pension obligations as part of a 30-year plan. And we'll have to keep our options open, and we'll need to be flexible and listen carefully to what the needs are as we go on forward.
Thank you. Jill, one of the big costs is healthcare, and healthcare policy is ever evolving. There was a recent call by advocates to basically cancel the contract with the Affordable Care operation that manages a lot of the payments. So do you think that there are changes to be made in Vermont's healthcare system? And what changes do you think those might be?
Yeah,
in 2 minutes.
We could have a whole show about healthcare and healthcare reform. I mean, what's been really frustrating, honestly, for the past, this whole session, a majority of the work that we did around healthcare was reversing or protecting the changes that Trump was trying to make on healthcare. Like literally, we were like, okay, now he's taking out this part of the Affordable Care Act, and now we have to deal with this part of the Affordable Care Act. And it was really frustrating that a lot of our policy time was spent on defense because of what was happening in Washington. So I think in the big picture, when we're talking about healthcare, it is so critical who wins this presidential election, because it will have a big impact on what it means to the Affordable Care Act and what we are trying to do to increase access to high quality healthcare in Vermont while keeping costs down. And just like we were talking about broadband, the inequities because of COVID have shown in our healthcare system as well. And I think some of the investments that we talked about, like investing in broadband to expand access to telemedicine, looking for ways to make more investments and access to mental health care providers. The COVID, rightfully so, has created some really challenging situations for Vermonters, and they can't find a provider. I've had many constituents say, I've called 8 different healthcare providers. Like, there are no therapists accepting new patients. That is a big problem. And so I think when we look at healthcare, as we figure out what's happening in Washington and create our strategy and continue our work moving forward to expand access, a focus for me will definitely be access to mental health care providers.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's 2 psychiatrists working with old people in the city of Burlington practically. I mean, it's just actually remarkable how the issues of access are so acute, even in a place as dense as Burlington. Bob?
Well, that subject is one of the keys, I think, to the huge problem. I mean, even if we go down to the corrections budget, inavailability of mental health care. If you go to any of the facilities, Rutland, any place that has that sort of locked away mental health wings, they are at occupational capacity all the time. And mostly it's because we don't have places for them to be adequately treated in the community. There's this level of treatment for, people that are getting by, but when you actually involve yourself in crisis, correction seems to be the facility of choice, and that is just not fair to the citizens of the state of Vermont to have that as their only option. It all boils down to money. So that's eventually the thing that we're always going to be talking about. But we, have to make some significant strides in that area. A jail is not a place to get great mental health service.
Do you think there's money to be saved in this contract that the state has with the Affordable Care entity?
Well, I don't think we've gone through it far enough yet to determine. I mean, these things do take a while to adjust to when you're talking about huge systems. And the healthcare system is one of our largest systems to deal with. There's an interplay there, I'm sure, between the insurance industry and this industry, trying to make things work more effectively together. I'm certainly willing to give it a little bit of time to work its way through. So far, the experience hasn't been stellar, but those things turn around as people get more and more used to it. So yeah, we got into it for a 5-year period. We should run the 5-year period, but at the end of that, I don't think we should be pulling any punches about whether we stay or go based on performance.
Thank you. Carol Odie, your take on the healthcare costs and the pressures it's putting on our state and how to maybe address equitable distribution of care.
Well, regarding inequities in healthcare, part of the budget bill was to look at healthcare disparities and to make recommendations to focus on low-income population and BIPOC, Black, Indigenous people of color, and how they are impacted by the way healthcare is distributed in our state. Another difficulty with the high cost of healthcare is that it really has a stranglehold on our economy and on Vermonters, and we need federal engagement. In the last biennium, we passed a way to decrease the cost of prescription drugs, and we are waiting for approval from the federal government so that we can move forward and Vermont can create a plan so that we can save Vermonters money on their prescription medication and bring down healthcare costs. And I could go on, but.
Okay, very good. Thank you. I want to go back to the racial equity question that you talked a little bit about, and maybe we'll just start with you, Bob. Do you support reparations and apologizing for Vermont's role in maintaining a systemically racist community? And do you think, and what do you think it's going to actually take to create an inclusive state?
Oh, you saved the zinger for last. The apology, without question. Reparations, I've spent time kind of looking at it, and there's such a broad representation of what that might be that I think it's pretty hard at this point to land on a yes or no. The devil is always in the details to this degree. What will it take? I mean, I think racial equity is a learning process, and it's so trite to some degree when you say that kids aren't that way until they learn to be that way. And I think it's basically an educational need to get people away from that. Mr. Trump does nothing to support or help that at this point with his positions, and that kind of demonstrates that when you let these things out of the bottle, they're very hard to get back in. I think, there are so many societies on the globe that don't have these problems. We seem to be infested with it. I think we need to look beyond our borders to find solutions.
Here's a question that maybe all of you can reflect on, but just to follow up. When you say putting it back in the bottle, do you think we could create a state where it isn't in the bottle, that actually kind of the root of hate and intolerance and systemically perpetuating that view of other people is eradicated. I mean, is that Pollyanna or is that possible, Bob? And then Carol.
Well, it's possible, but I just heard on the news today how much more functional societies are when they don't have to worry about food, they don't have to worry about housing, they don't have to worry about jobs, they don't have to worry about whether or not they're going to have enough money to make it to the end of the week or the month or whatever their pay period happens to be. You always run into this, somebody has something that I don't have, friction. We have gone so far beyond the pale of, there's like so many people that have so much and so many multiples of that have so little, that until we start to solve society's problems in general, I don't think we're going to start to solve society's problems specifically. And this is one of the escapes that a lot of people use to justify anger at other things. Okay. I don't know if it answers your question or not, but this is broad reaching and it's a fundamental function of government to address these things. And at this point, our government on the federal level, which is what coordinates everybody, is unwilling to do so. I think that's a huge part of the problem. Thank
you. Carol.
Well, not until there is no more structural and systemic racism will we all be living in the kind of America that we all wish, that envision for ourselves. And over the past 10 years, we've done quite a bit of work in the legislature so that we were well poised as the national and local conversations turned to racism and ending structural and systemic racism, to reimagine policing in Vermont. And we passed 3 pieces of legislation this year. S-119, which was vetoed by the governor, which had to do with modernizing a 150-year-old state law that would have standardized the use of force and deadly force in Vermont. And we were basing that law a little on what South Burlington has in its ordinances and on federal law and other states' laws. And we wrote it with huge input from one of the members of our legislative committee and judiciary, who is a former state police officer. And the second bill is the corrections reform, where we're asking the Commissioner of Corrections to create a plan for recruiting diverse individuals and do a really good job of recruiting, period, training and supervision so that of employees, so that we have a safe and healthy work environment for employees, and so that the prison system is a different kind of place to be. We are getting people ready to leave our correctional facilities. Most people will leave them and need to be able to function and be healthy in our communities. And finally, we passed S-124, where we have new standards for officers, data collection, body cameras, moving toward a statewide policy for that, and where we are banning facial recognition. And we have a criminal justice council, but we are including more community members on it. We're including members of the NAACP, the Vermont League of Cities and Towns, a mental health counselor, someone who suffers from mental health illness, and Vermont's Director of Racial Equity.
Thank you. Thank you. That's a pretty comprehensive portfolio of things that are happening.
Yeah. And last year, even before this was coming up, we passed something where we would look for new Vermont standards in our schools having to do with social and racial equity. So we've been working.
Thank you.
In addition, oh, sorry, Lauren Glenn, go ahead.
No, go ahead. Yeah.
I was just going to continue on what Carol was saying about some of the work that we've been doing in the legislature to address this. But in addition to that, we are moving a constitutional amendment that would take slavery out of our Constitution. And if we pass it again next legislative session, then it'll be on the ballot in 2022. So just wanted to remind people about that because that happened earlier this session. But going back to your question, I think Carol did a great job describing all the bills that we've been working on and passing, and we're absolutely committed to breaking down structural racism in our state. And I have to say that to do that, we actually have to recognize it. A lot of people feel like we're in this bubble and what's happening across the country really isn't happening here. And that is not true. It's just simply not true. And this president has given white supremacists a platform to be seen and to be heard. And because of that, we have lost some incredible voices in our work because of the intimidation of white supremacists in this state. We lost Kaya Morris. She was a fantastic state representative who was on to do great things. And I tell you, even now, a couple years after that happened with Kaya, when I'm out there talking to women about running for office, especially women of color, they do not feel safe running in this state. That is a problem. So until we start addressing this and recognizing that we have white supremacists in our state and they are bullying people and that they are harassing people, and that us and our and our privilege need to step up and not only be allies but to be co-conspirators and work with communities to be all in this together. I feel like in a lot of communities we feel sheltered, and it's just not the case. We have a huge problem in our state, and we need to address it.
Thank you. Could you make the segue, Jill, to the biggest impacts of COVID-19 on Vermont, and where you see the opportunities and the challenges, given that we're in this for several more months? Hard to know exactly how many more, but this is where we are right now. And we'll be in when the next session starts.
That is such a good question. I mean, we've touched on so many issues in this 35 minutes talking about the impact that COVID has had in our state. I think that, in this moment of great change and challenge, and we see these structural flaws, we have an opportunity to take this moment to make them better and to make them stronger. So for example, our state colleges system has been falling apart and underfunded. And we have a moment here with this infusion of COVID money to bridge and give our higher education institutions some time to figure out how can we structure our public higher education system so that it's strong, it's going to be long lasting, and that our Vermont students can afford it. We talk a lot about how we can level the playing field for everyone. And right now, higher ed is not accessible for everyone. And access to higher ed shouldn't depend on where you were born, what zip code you live in, or what color skin you have. And so I think that, we could say all of the issues we've talked about have been impacted by COVID. I think this is one we really haven't touched on tonight that I think we can make some progress on.
Thank you. Bob Hooper, your thoughts on the COVID-19 pandemic, its effect on Vermont, and ways forward?
Well, I think it's, as Jill said, it's sort of pulled the blanket back on all the potholes that we maybe were ignoring because we couldn't address, or maybe we were ignoring because we didn't have money for, or maybe we were ignoring because we just didn't have an awareness of. College education period ties into the social equity thing so intensely. The medical piece, all this stuff is so integrated into one big problem. I think we found out most of the impact, I think, has been on people's lifestyle. We're sitting here looking at each other on a computer as opposed to sitting in the studio, which, by the way, I miss very much. But it's a new lifestyle. It's a new way that we're going to have to interact with people. It's a new way that we're going to have to express ourselves as a society. And it's going to be difficult. It's almost like we just landed on the shores of the new America, and we're going to put a society together that's a little different than the one that we came from. And I think it's going to be a little bit of a Braille thing. We're going to have to find our way as we feel the way along. I have no idea, quite frankly, what's going to be popping up next to make us go, oh, gee. But I hope we have the experience and depth to deal with it, which I think we've done a pretty good job of doing so far.
Yeah, thank you. We haven't even gotten into how to run a legislature remotely, but Carol, why don't you talk about what COVID-19 looks like for you in terms of impact and ways forward?
Well, access to healthcare, I think, is going to be a very big long-term challenge because when the hospitals shut down to elective surgeries, their main source of revenue dwindled. And they did this to prepare for the possible influx of COVID-19 patients. But many Vermonters didn't get the medical care they needed and had to wait. And the legislature then used COVID-19 dollars to help our hospitals. But now that the hospitals are up and running again, they face inadequate funding of their budgets for the next year due to inadequate rate increases they've asked for from the Green Mountain Care Board. Hospitals serve Vermonters when we're sick. They serve as the hub in a hub and spoke model to treat our family members struggling with addiction and mental health issues. They've been integral to the opening of UVM, for example, the fourth largest employer in the state, to saving lives in our nursing homes, and as they work with those facilities to stop the spread of COVID-19 within them. And I think we need to do better for our hospitals. The legislature passed several important bills like telemedicine, which I talked about before. And that's something that we have to keep looking for solutions like telemedicine that really change the game and will help our work going forward. And another big area is education in our children and childcare. We have enormous pressures facing our children and our school children, our teachers and our families. And we're working hard to keep learning going for our children and to keep families functioning as families, and caregivers often have to balance their work with educating and caring for their children. And we have to support our schools, our educators, and the children who are, according to a conversation with a school nurse, experiencing stress and fear and isolation and uncertainty with the disruption of their normal schedules.
Yeah. Okay.
That's okay.
I got it's a lot. It's epic. It's the
and it's big.
climate catastrophe.
What do you choose to say?
Exactly. Do you want to go into a 1-minute closing statement, Representative Carol Odie?
Okay. Well, I've listened carefully to the people of Chittenden 6-1, and I have brought and will continue to bring their priorities to the State House on the economy, the environment, and education, and equity. I was instrumental in 2 big achievements for my district, one of them having to do with being one of the advocates for the waiting study, and the other for increasing clean water funding by $7.4 million yearly. Before I started as a state representative 4 years ago, I was not fully aware of just how incredible our state government is and how well we legislators would work together. When COVID-19 hit, we continued forward, first in the nation, to pass much needed legislation to help all Vermonters. And we allocated $1.2 billion to our people in our state. We held together and did our work for many months. Looking at how much of the legislature does for Vermonters over an incredibly diverse set of subject areas, and in collaboration with our colleagues, and with most votes coming out of committees unanimously or nearly unanimously, and coming from the floor unanimously or nearly unanimously, I am just so grateful every day for the chance to be part of this Vermont way of getting things done for Vermonters and to building a stronger, healthier Vermont. I am grateful for the voters' past support and ask for your vote this election day. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks very much. I have a lot of pressure to time out. Jill Krowinski, your closing comments, minute or less.
When this horrible pandemic began and the stay-at-home order was issued, our community was deeply impacted and continues to recover today. The number of calls, emails, and texts I received from neighbors needing help and having issues applying for unemployment was off the charts. I advocated for dozens of people when it became clear that the Scott administration was not prepared or unable to handle this problem. In response, I created a platform for legislators to better communicate with the Department of Labor in order to expedite these checks to Vermonters. And when I see a problem, I can't sit and wait for someone else to fix it. I have a long track record of bringing people together to solve problems and pass legislation that reflects our values. As your legislator, I will continue to work hard to solve these problems facing us as we recover from this pandemic and build a stronger, healthier Vermont. Thank you, and I hope I can count on your support.
Thank you. Jill Jill Krowinski is running in District 6-3 along with Curt McCormack, who couldn't join us tonight. Bob Hooper, your closing comments, please.
I feel at a disadvantage because I didn't write any closing comments. And I just kind of want to say, when I ran for the legislature, one of the primary things that I said when I went to people's doors was I plan to go down there and do something. And I plan to continue to try to get down there and do something. Whether it's going around the neighborhoods and dropping comment cards off at your door, or hanging around the bagel every other Saturday to listen to what you have to say. My game in this game is to listen to what you as the voters of the area want to have happen. So when unemployment broke, as we knew that it would, we were able to go in and help people through the back door sometimes. We were able to get stuff done. And I think that that's really what you want in somebody that goes to Montpelier to represent you, an ear and an action plan. So that's what I'm going to take back again. I hope to be, Jill, put your hands over your ears, more active in speaking up for things this time than I was in my first term. But
Great.
I think we've done well.
Thank you. I really appreciate that the three of you could join us. Bob Hooper is from District 6-1 in the New North End, along with Carol Odie. Thank you very much. You are Democrats who are uncontested for these two seats. And Jill Krowinski is running with Curt McCormack in District 6-3 in the Old North End, and you are uncontested for your seats as Democrats. So thank you again for joining us. A pleasure to see you all, and thank you for your service. Thanks from Town Meeting Television. Stay tuned to continuing coverage of General Election 2020. And don't forget, election results starts at 7:30 on the 3rd of November. Thanks for watching.
Thank you, Lauren Glenn.
Bye.
Thank you for having us.
Everybody have a